Good morning, church. It's great to see all your beautiful faces this morning. So my wife and Ashley and I, we met in the summer of 2014 doing an internship in Nashville. And as Ashley tells the story, she walked into our office space and she saw me across the room, and her first thought was, wow, that's my future husband. That's a pretty deep thought, pretty crazy. When I saw her walk in the room, I saw her and I said, wow, she's hot. That was my first thought with her. But then we began, actually the very next day, we went on our first date. We went to Radnor Lake, went hiking, and from there we had an amazing summer together. We did long distance for a year and a half. But how many people in this room have dated before? Anybody? Okay, there's a lot of married people in this room, and did you? Okay. But when you're dating, you know that there's a season of time when you're dating and it's so exciting and it's new and everything you do, it's just like, I'm getting to know you, and every date's exciting and it's an amazing time. But every guy in this room who is married or engaged knows that there comes a time where you as a boyfriend is not good enough anymore. That she no longer wants a fling, she wants that bling, you know what I'm saying? And so I don't know what causes that shift necessarily, but for us, it happened in the fall of 2015. And I had just recently taken this position here at the church, so maybe she saw my youth pastor salary and was like, I want to be a part of that. I don't know what it was, but the shift happened. And if you've experienced this in your relationship, you know that from that point on, there is no going back to the good old days. Because every conversation comes back to, so what's the plan? When are we going to engage? What's going to happen? Where should we get married? What's the wedding date? Where's our honeymoon? All this stuff. Then if you're a guy and you just want to hang out and date, you're going to go crazy. It all came to a head for us on December 29, 2015. Her family had come into town. We came to church. We had a nice meal at Puckett's, and her family left. Okay, but we got back in the car. Let's just say that Ashley was less than happy. Because in her mind, she was thinking, my family was in town. It's almost the new year. This could be an amazing time for him to propose. And so our car ride after that was a lot of, are we ever going to get engaged? Is this ever going to happen? Do you even love me? Are you even committed to me? Do you want to spend the rest of your life with me? When's it going to happen? I don't even know anything anymore. The whole time, I was just like, babe, trust me. Do you trust me? Trust me. Do you trust me? Over and over again. Because little did she know that for the past 2 months, I've been preparing. I got a ring custom made. None of this Genesis jewelry stuff. I got a custom ring made. I planned it so that when her family came, it would look like they're leaving, and they would actually not leave. Had my family come down. And that night, I put a blindfold on her, took her to the place we first met, proposed. She cried, I cried, everybody cried. It was an amazing experience. But in that moment, in that car, there was a trust breakdown between her and I, because what she saw was in this moment that what she wanted was not happening. And all she could see was her reality in that moment of when she held out her hand, there was no ring, and that was an issue. Right? But for me, I had the whole perspective. I knew my plan. I knew what was coming, but in her limited perspective, it caused anxiety and worry and a breakdown of trust in our relationship. Now, let me just say, I have permission to share that story. She actually told me to share it. So I am smart enough, even to 2 years in my marriage, to make sure that I get permission to share stuff like that, okay? But I think in our relationship with God, sometimes there can be a trust breakdown in our lives because all we see is our current situation. The only perspective we have is what we don't have. Instead of seeing the whole perspective that God is in control, he sees the before, he sees the after, he has the whole plan. I believe what God is telling us and asking us is, do you trust me? He's telling us this morning, trust me. In this year, we're walking into a year of freedom as a church, but I believe that if we're going to experience freedom, that if we're going to walk into the promises that God has for us, that the foundation has to be built on trusting God. That trusting God is essential to our freedom. Right now, Ashley and I are in a season of stepping out. And so this message is coming straight from what I'm experiencing right now. That Ashley started her own business as she left a 9-to-5 job and a solid paycheck to start her own thing. And it's amazing. And we love stepping out and chasing our dreams. But what that means is that there isn't a paycheck being deposited to a bank account every 2 weeks. And in my heart, in my mind, sometimes my fear and anxiety can come around money. From a young age, that was something that I began struggling with, was always worrying about finances and wondering where it's going to come from. Are we going to be okay? And trying to figure out how to make finances work. And what God is teaching me in this season is, Craig, trust me. That if you want to experience all that I have for you and Ashley, if you want to experience the fullness of life that I have for you, you're not going to be able to figure it out on your own. It's not going to be worth the fear and anxiety and the worry. Trust me. We've been reading through the Bible the past couple weeks as a church, and we're going to be doing it for the rest of the year. How many of you are following along with us as we do that? Anybody? Yeah, it's a powerful thing. And this week we came on the story of Abraham. How many of you know Abraham from his song? Father Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons. Okay, if you don't know what it is, don't look it up. It's not really that great. It's not really worth it, okay? But we think of Abraham as this man of faith. He was like the father of all generations, and really Jesus came through him, and ultimately we came through his faithfulness, and he's this mighty man. But the reality is that Abraham struggled with some extreme trust issues when it came to God's promises. We see that when God called him to leave Ur, he settled in Egypt, and there was a situation that happened that he was afraid that the Egyptians would kill him. So when it came time to introduce his wife to Pharaoh, he said, "This is my sister." And he gave his wife to Pharaoh to be his wife. Just a little pro tip, guys. Never try this at home. Because if this happens, there is no coming back. You'll be locked in the doghouse forever, okay? It was a different time, and somehow they rebounded their marriage. But again, at 75 years old, okay, 75 years old, God comes, and he gives him a promise. Just a real quick observation. We never outgrow trusting God. There will never be an age where you get to a point where it's like, okay, I'm good, I just trust God, and I can float through. Trust is a lifelong process of learning what it means to trust and walk in God's promises and his provision. So God comes to Abraham when he's 75 years old. We pick up the story in Genesis 15. It says, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." And then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. When God comes to Abram, who will one day be named Abraham, all Abram sees is the problem with God's promise. He says, "Sovereign Lord, but here's why this can't happen." I think a lot of us have a head knowledge of God's provision, but when it comes to our reality, there's a breakdown in trust because we look at our situation and we don't see how it could possibly happen. So we fast forward 24 years and we see that his wife Sarah also had some trust issues, that God comes back and he renews his promise with Abraham that he will provide a son. This is what happens. It says, "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent. Women, always eavesdropping. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Both Abraham and Sarah had some extreme trust issues when it came to God's promise. But I wonder this morning if where you're at in life, there's a trust breakdown between you and the Lord because the current situation you're in, you don't see a way out. It's almost laughable because you look at what you believe God's promised or the freedom that he's promised, and where you're at from your position, it seems impossible that he could come through. Maybe in your marriage, you're just so unhappy and you're at a place where it seems impossible that God could fix what's going on. Maybe with your kids, you know God, the kids are supposed to be like arrows in your quiver, but it seems like God gave you some broken arrows. And maybe in your marriage, you're trying to have kids, but you don't understand God's timing, and it's not working, and it's discouraging. I know there's students in this room, and you want to step into all that God has for you, but you're trying to discern what God has for your life, but you don't have a vision and clarity, and so there's a trust breakdown that can happen in our lives. Some people in this room I know are struggling with health issues, and you haven't seen God move, and you've trusted God, and you've wanted him to move, but he hasn't. There's disappointment, and there's frustration, and trust breakdown happens. And when a trust breakdown happens, when we have trust issues, I believe what happens is something I'm calling the trust gap. And the trust gap is our current position, where we stand today, and it's the distance between our current position and God's promise. And that where we stand here, there's a gap of trust, and until we bridge that gap, we will never step into fully all that God has. And so for us, as we step into this year of freedom, if we are going to experience all that God has for us, we have to bridge that gap. And so this morning, I'm going to talk about the 10 ways to bridge the gap. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do 10 ways. Some of you are like, 10 ways? Most of you get excited when the youth pastor preaches because you know it's going to be shorter, okay? One day I'm going to bring a long message to y'all. But 3 ways that we can learn to bridge the gap of trust so that we can step into the promises that God has for us. Number 1, we need to trust God primarily. When God came to Abraham, what happened was that Abraham got fixated in the problem instead of seeing the provider. In that moment, he magnified the problem of not having kids instead of magnifying that the provider is greater than the problem. I think a lot of times in our lives, what's the closest to us is the problem. So in our limited vision, all we see is how big the problem is, and we're out of perspective of seeing that God, the provider, is so much greater, is so much bigger, and when we trust him, our problems are nothing compared to him. Proverbs 3, 5 through 6, we also came on these verses this week in the weekly reading. And if you need life verses, I don't know if there's better verses to have, but to trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. I think a lot of our problems come when we invest our trust in the wrong places. How many of you have dabbled in or invested in the stock market? Anybody? Some of you? Anybody investing in Bitcoin right now? All right. Here's the thing about investing. If you invest your money, you are tied to your investment. You are tied to the hope that you have placed there because your money is there. So when the stock market goes up, you're happy and excited. But then the next day when it goes down, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm so worried. What's going to happen to my money? The next day it goes back up and you're excited. Right now, both Bitcoin and the stock market have taken a little plunge. And so if you're invested right now, you're looking at your stock portfolio and you're like, oh man, what am I going to do? And next week it's going to go back up and you're like, I'm rich, my future is bright. And it's going to go back down and up. And I think a lot of times in our spiritual walk too, we live our life like that. We invest our trust in relationships. We invest our trust in money. We invest our trust in our job. We invest our trust in ourselves. And what happens is when we have a good day, we have hope. And we believe for God's promises. Then we have a bad day, and something happens to us, or the person we're investing our trust in fails us, then we're back down at the bottom. It's up and down and up and down and up and down. But the only place that we can invest our trust that is a sure, safe investment that will never go down is if we invest our trust in the Lord. Numbers 23:19 says, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? And the rhetorical answer there is, the rhetorical answer to that question is no. God doesn't promise and not fulfill. He comes through on every promise he makes. He is God. He cannot change. I think sometimes we don't invest our trust in God because we have been hurt by other people. Maybe in relationships, there's been broken promises, broken trust, and so we put that on the Lord. Or when Abraham and Sarah, when they have this perspective, they say, God, you have not given us children. They have this wrong view of God, that God hasn't come through, because I'm sure they were walking in disappointment that God hadn't. In their view, God hadn't come through. And so they put their disappointment, frustration on God's provision instead of trusting that, God, your plan is perfect and your provision is sure, that you don't change. They were worried and they had fear and anxiety. And if we're going to walk in all that God has and the freedom He has, we have to trust in the Lord with all of our hearts, primarily with everything that we are. In my marriage with Ashley, she needs to know that my trust is primarily in the Lord. How can I lead her when I'm trying to lean on something that's not there, when I'm trying to lean on my understanding, when I'm trying to lean on my ability to provide, when I'm trying to lean on my own wisdom? Your marriage has to be founded on two people who are trusting in the Lord fully. Your family has to be founded on that. Your workplace has to be founded. You're trusting the Lord fully. And when we trust the Lord with all of our hearts, lean not on our own understanding, submit to him in all of our ways, then we become more trustworthy. Not because we are amazing, but because we're planted firmly in the provision and the promise and the truth of who God is. Are you planted? Are you trusting in God primarily? Or where are you investing your trust this morning? If you want to walk in the freedom that God has for you, he has to be the place you put your trust. To minimize your problem and elevate the provider and see his power in your situation. So first, we need to trust God primarily. Number two, we need to trust God's path. How many of you are subscribed to Amazon Prime? Anybody? Yeah. I won't do my shopping any other way now. But it's gotten to the point where 2-day shipping now feels like forever. Doesn't it? You're like, it shouldn't take 2 days to get this thing here. They're actually testing a pilot here in Nashville that you could have 2-hour delivery. 2 hours, but there's going to come a day when 2 hours is too much. I think there's going to be one day where every single new home is built with a chute attached to it. And when you just click order, it goes zip, a little thing, your little robot goes over and he grabs it for you, he brings it to you, and you're set to go. When we live in a culture that wants everything now, that wants our comfort, from the beginning of time, we've been trying to figure out how we make our life more easy and more comfortable. But the reality is, in God's kingdom and on God's path, that's not how he operates. It's not how he works most of the time. That he isn't about our comfort. He isn't about easy. He wants to teach us. He wants us to have to trust in him with all of our hearts. And he knows that if he just let us get there, if we were comfortable, then we would just trust in ourselves. God's path isn't always easy. There was a 25-year gap between when God promised a son and when he was born. And I think there's a temptation when God is taking too long that we want to help him speed up the process. And so there's this very interesting story that happens with Abraham and Sarah, and we'll just read it. It says that, now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave, and perhaps I can build a family through her. Men in this room, another pro tip. If you ever find yourself in any situation remotely close to one like this, get up, walk out of the room, and never talk about it again. Because you even discuss this option, there is no coming back from this. Right? It would have been great if Abraham would have stepped back and been like, Sarah, okay, hold up, okay. That's a little crazy, but what if we go and we seek the Lord, right? Remember, he made this promise to us. What if we go and we make sure that this is his path? Oh, let's make sure that this is what he wants us to do. That would have been great. That would have been a great response by Abraham. But that's not what he did. It says Abraham agreed to what Sarai had said. No pushback. He just agreed. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. All right, we can look at that story. We can be kind of judgmental, I think, of that. Like, how would that ever happen? But you got to think from their perspective, at this point, there had been a promise that God had made. And you got to think that they had been trying to have kids before they were 75. So God then makes his promise, and then they probably keep trying to have kids, and it's not happening. Can you imagine the frustration and the disappointment they must have felt? And the insecurity they must have felt. Sarah must have felt so insecure. I'm supposed to be part of this promise, but I can't even provide what is the essential part of this. And so let's try to do it a different way. And I think sometimes when it comes to the promises of God, when it's not happening quick enough, we can get disappointed and frustrated, and we can try to take shortcuts to God's promise. Here's the reality about shortcuts. They have a lot of unintended consequences. That when Ishmael was born to Hagar, there was some mama arguments, mama trouble, and Sarah hated Hagar. She was jealous of her. I mean, how could there not be issues between them? So Sarah says, send away my slave Hagar. God takes care of Hagar and Ishmael, but Ishmael's descendants become a thorn in the flesh to Abraham's descendants. And to this very day, there is still enmity between the two. Right? The choice they made didn't just have an impact on them, it had an impact on future generations. Here's what I believe, that when God makes a promise and there's a gap between the promise and the fulfillment, is that the enemy loves to come in and provide shortcuts. And they're tempting, and they look really good Think about Sarah and Abram. God had promised that he's going to provide flesh and blood. So you think about this situation. Technically, this child would be Abraham's flesh and blood. Like, that might work. But just because you have a good option doesn't mean it's God's best option. And what I encourage you this morning is that if in front of you, you see shortcuts. Maybe you're looking for intimacy in your marriage. You see shortcuts and ways to find it in other places outside of your marriage. You're tempted to leave your family, or you're tempted to walk into things that you shouldn't, or to walk into a new job, or leave. Whatever it is that is a shortcut to God's promise, I want to encourage you to not give in to that, to stay the course. I know that there's some in this room who you're disappointed and you're frustrated. You're tired. You don't see God working and moving. You don't know if he's trustworthy anymore. And so you're tempted to either give up or take a shortcut. My encouragement to you is don't give up. God's promises are sure. In Proverbs, he promises that he will make your path straight. He does not promise he'll make your path easy or he'll make your path short, but he will make it straight. It may take longer and it may look different than you think it will, but he will make it straight and his promise will be fulfilled. I want to skip forward to when Isaac is eventually born in Genesis 21. It says, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. The Lord is gracious. I want to remind you of that this morning, that God is for you. God is gracious. He has good plans for you. So he did what he had promised for her. And Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. Here's the amazing thing about our God. He is never late. He's never late. He might not work on our timetable, right? There was a 25-year gap between the promise and the fulfillment. That's as long as I've been alive. Like, that feels like a long time. But God was not late. They felt like he was, but he wasn't. I want to remind you this morning, encourage you that God is not late in your life. That what he has promised to accomplish and fulfill in your life will happen. You may not see it, you might not understand it, you might not understand the timing or how it's going to happen, but he will not be late. He is gracious, his promises are sure, and his timing is perfect. And I think we try to rush the wait, but I believe that it's in the pause that God's preparing us for his promise. That God used that time to prepare Abraham and Sarah, and that it was going to be that through this wait, that when it happened, the only thing that they could point to was that this was God. Right? Sometimes if he would have provided a son to Abraham right after he promised at 75, it still would have been possible. But you wait 25 years, and all of a sudden it's not possible. And then when God shows up, there's no other place to point than to him and his provision. And in your life right now, the pause that you think is a broken promise is God preparing you for his promise, so that when you get there, you can rightly handle it and point to him for the glory. Don't rush the pause. Don't rush the wait. God is working in this time. Trust his path. So first, we have to trust God primarily. Second, we have to trust his path. And number three, trust God's provision. I think when you trust God primarily and you're founded in him, then when you're trusting God's path and you're not trying to take shortcuts and you understand that his timing is perfect, then trusting his provision becomes a lot easier. I'm going to skip ahead in the story of Abraham a little bit. We'll get to this week in our reading, but Genesis 22 talks about an ask that God makes of Abraham that's pretty extreme. And it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. And early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son, Isaac. So God literally, he provides Isaac, and then he comes to Abraham and says to test him, but Abraham doesn't know this. And he says, I want you to give me your son. I want you to sacrifice him to me. Think about being a parent and being asked to sacrifice your child. Maybe a child that you've been waiting years and 25 years to have, and then God comes to you and says, I'm actually going to take him away from you. You would think that Abraham, given his past track record, would pipe up and say, but God, but no. He doesn't have any conversation with God. He just got up and he obeyed. He got up and he obeyed. I think Abraham at this point was able to look back at God's provision and trust that I don't understand, God, what you're doing, but I'm going to move forward anyways. And so he gets up, he loads up Isaac. They go up the mountain. It's a couple-day journey. As Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. And as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. I love the confidence that Abraham has in this moment. He's walking forward. He's moving forward. He doesn't have the answers of how God's going to provide, but he fully trusts that God is going to provide. And I wonder if looking into the eyes of his son, who is questioning and bewildered, that he remembers and he sees in his son God's provision. And he's reminded through his son, okay, I don't understand this situation, how it's going to work out, but I've seen him provide. You are that provision. I trust that he's going to provide again. So they get up to the mountain, and it says when they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. Can you imagine the relief he must have felt in this moment? He's literally raising his hand to slay his son, and then God steps in. Says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. And he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to it this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." God shows up, not early, not late, just in time. Just in time. As he's raising it up and all hope is being lost, God steps in. And maybe in your life this morning, you feel like you're at that point where the knife is lifted and there is no hope left. And maybe that's the point that God wants to step in and show up and show his provision. And I love that Abraham literally marked the place, called the place, "God will provide." And Moses, writing this years and years and years later, says that to this very day, that when people look at this mountain, they look at it and say, on this mountain, God will provide. And I can imagine that in later years when Isaac has his sons, Jacob and Esau, that he sits them down and tells them this story over and over again of the time where their grandpa Abraham almost sacrificed him. But God provided. And Jacob and Esau telling their kids, man, your grandpa, your great-grandpa Abraham was crazy. Right? He almost killed your grandpa, okay? But God provided. And it became a marker of God's faithfulness for future generations. It's like when we went to the moon, if we went to the moon. I don't know if it actually happened. But they plant the flag in the ground, make a stake in the ground that we have been here. And I think for some of us, when God shows up in our lives, we need to plant the flag in the ground, say, this is the place that God provided. And what God is going to do in your life is not just for you, that he is setting up a trend of trust for future generations to come. That when they look at your life, your marriage, your family, what you walk through, your health, and you see where God provided, they will be able to point to that place and say, but God provided there, and I know he's going to provide for me. That what God is doing is not limited to you. That what God is doing in your life this morning is so much greater. He has not forgotten you, not just because he loves you, because he does, but he is also after so much more, that he wants to use your life and what he's doing in your life to be a testimony to other people of his faithfulness and his goodness and his provision. Don't give up, because it might be just at that moment that God wants to step in, so that there is no doubt in anybody's mind that it was him who provided. I'm going to ask Michael and Christiane to come up. I don't know personally where you're at this morning. I don't know what you're walking through. But you might feel like you're up against the impossible. You might feel like there's no way for that God couldn't provide at this place. But what I love about God, and we see this all throughout Scripture, is that God specializes in making a way where there is no way. That's in the impossible that he shows himself in the most beautiful ways. What I love about the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac is that it points directly to the provision of Jesus. Romans 5:6 says, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. That when we were on the altar, we were the ones to be killed, that God stepped in at just the right time, not early, not late, at just the right time when we were powerless to save ourselves, and provided Jesus as a sacrifice. And as Christians, our foundation of trust for God in our spiritual needs comes from being able to trust him from his provision for our spiritual needs. That it's through the provision of Jesus, that is the marker for us as Christians to be able to point back and say, but God provided. He provided for me at the deepest need that I have spiritually, that when I was powerless, I couldn't do anything, I couldn't figure out, I couldn't lean on my own ability to save myself, that he stepped in and he provided the way through Jesus. That's why the gospel is still important for us past coming to know Christ. We don't just pray a prayer and God, Jesus, I believe you, but we have to be reminded of the gospel day in and day out, that Christ came for us, that God made a way where there was no way. And it's in that promise that we can have hope, that we can trust that God will provide for all of our needs, because what Jesus has done was done once and for all. And this morning, I don't know if there's a better way for us to close than through taking communion together, because communion for us as Christians is like our flag planted in the ground of God's provision. Then when we do it, we're literally coming to the table and we're taking the juice and the body, being reminded of God's past provision through Jesus, and we're looking forward to his future provision through Jesus coming back. And it's when we come to the table that we can have confidence that between the past and the future and everything in between, God is faithful and God will provide. And so this morning as we take communion, I want to do it a little differently, that they're going to pass the plate and you're going to take the cup and they're inside each other. You got to take them apart. But what I want you to do, instead of just immediately taking it, if you're with your family or with your spouse or you're by yourself, wherever you're at and whatever you're walking through, maybe it's a marriage thing, maybe it's a family thing, a financial thing, a personal thing, wherever you're, I just want you to pause. If you need to circle up with your family and pray, with your wife, your spouse to pray, just by yourself to pray, I want you to take a moment to pause and just be reminded of the trustworthiness of God in this time. It might be good just to pray that prayer, Lord, help us to trust in you with all of our hearts, to not lean our own understanding as a family, as a couple, as an individual, to submit ourselves to you, and will you make our path straight? But I also believe that there's some people in this room this morning, you've never put your trust in Jesus as your foundation. And this morning, if that's where you're at, I want to encourage you. There is no better place to put your trust. If you want to walk in the freedom that God has for you, if you want to walk in the fullness of life, it comes through Jesus. And that where you're at this morning, you can take that step. Do you believe that Christ came and died for you, like Pastor Charlie was explaining earlier, and that he gave his life for you, and that you will put your trust in him? You can and will be saved. The promise of God is sure. So you can either do that at your seat, or you can come up. We would love to pray for you. But for some of you, I believe there needs to be renewed trust. You trust God, but there has been discouragement and frustration, and this needs to be a time of renewed trust. I want to read the scripture where Jesus institutes communion, and then I'm going to ask the ushers to serve the offering, and I just want you to take that time to just be together with your family, your spouse, and take a time to pray together. But then we're going to continue to worship. And if you need prayer over any situation, I'm going to ask Pastor Daniel, Pastor Harry, Pastor Charlie, I'll be up at the front. We would love to be up here to pray for you, no matter what you're going through. And so let's just lean into this moment and what God wants to do. But in Matthew 26, it says that while they were eating, Jesus took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your provision. God, we can trust your provision primarily because you are a God who never changes. We can trust you because, God, your promises are sure and your timing is perfect. Lord, I pray for those in this room this morning who are tired and weary and who don't see your promise because they're stuck seeing the problem. Lord, I pray this morning that you would enter in to their situation. You would show yourself to be the sovereign God, the trustworthy God that you are. Lord, I pray for those who are tempted to take shortcuts this morning. Lord, I pray that you would reveal to them and remind them of your goodness, your path, that you are not late. You don't need their help. Their role is just to trust you, and you will fulfill your promise. And Lord, we thank you for your provision of Jesus that we can trust. We can trust that you will provide for all of our needs because we can look back at the marker, flag in the ground, point to the cross and say, that's where God provided. God, would you move in this time in a powerful way? In your name we pray. Amen.